Greetings and welcome to Tactical Inc., your portal to the captivating realm of all things Lorcana. I'm Bradley.
And I'm Alex. Today we're going to talk about how to improve on your starter deck and make it better. Rise of the Floodborn introduced 2 new starter decks.
And with these starter decks, we want to use a budget of $40 to help you improve your decks, to make them even more consistent and even more competitive.
With that $40, we've used TCG Player's market price. We're recording at the beginning of January, so prices may change by the time this video is released. However, it should still be somewhere around that $40 mark.
So first of all, let's talk about the 2 starter decks released with Rise of the Floodborn. We have an Amethyst Sapphire deck called Tactical Teamwork. This deck focuses on dwarfs to swarm the board and items to keep cards in your hand.
And the other starter deck is Might and Magic, an Amethyst Steel deck. This deck centers around 2 mechanics, resist and bounce. This deck likes to protect your things while also sneakily bringing in other characters to remove threats.
So looking deeper into these decks, let's point out the key cards in each deck and see what these decks are all about. And looking at Tactical Teamwork, our Amber Sapphire deck, we see the dwarves being key pieces in Amber. You want to get several of these guys out at a time and flood the board where your opponent won't be able to recover.
Yeah, I'm looking at Doc, leader of the 7 dwarves. He's a card that makes your characters cost 1 less. This allows you to begin playing multiple copies of the dwarves, or even playing other characters. Then we have the Queen Commanding Presence. She's a really great character if you can shift her out on turn 2 to have a 4/3 body, and remove some early game threats to allow you to protect your dwarves.
And looking at the Sapphire part of the deck, we see Popsicle, allowing you to cycle through your deck to find your dwarves, and also being able to remove damage from them. You also see Hiram Flaversham and Judy Hops, allowing you to draw more cards and get to what you need.
Now let's look at our second deck, the Amethyst Steel deck, Might and Magic. So for this deck, we want a lore rush. We will protect the questers with Bodyguard, Resist, and Bounce. For that reason, the key cards here will be the Merlin cards, Madam Mim cards, and our Bodyguards.
So when looking at these decks, we need to add cards to make them better, without changing the goal of the deck. We're also keeping our budget within that $40 range for each deck to improve them.
So let's look at some cards here with our first deck, Tactical Teamwork.
First, we want to expand on the dwarf and item theme. So a no-brainer would be add Snow White Houseguest. She lets you pay 1 less ink to play 7 dwarf characters. So she allows you to reduce their costs and bring more out at the same time.
And her effect can stack up, so the more of her you have, the more you can play. She also only costs 32 cents, so let's get 4 copies of her to add for a total of $1.28.
And since we are having a dwarf theme, let's add more dwarfs to have 3 or 4 copies of each dwarf. So let's add 1 Bashful for a total of 9 cents, 2 Docs for a total of 24 cents, 1 Dopey for a total of 6 cents, and 1 Happy for 7 cents. This brings our total of dwarfs up to having 3 copies of each, except with Doc, who has 4 copies, bringing up the total to $1.74.
Next we can add 4 copies of Lantern. This will help us bring out characters quicker and more of them. And since it's an item, it will help our item support as well. They cost $1.92 each, so this is an additional $7.68, bringing our total now to $9.42.
We also like the Queen Regal Monarch as a 1 ink drop to help bring out an early board presence. So let's get another one of her for 8 cents. And while we're at it, let's add 1 more of the Queen Commanding Presence for $1.94. Now our total is up to $11.44.
Looking at the item side of things, let's go ahead and add another Popsicle for 13 cents and 3 of Noi Orphan Thief for $4.89, bringing our total up to $16.46. Noi gains Resist +1 and Ward while you control an item. She's good in an item deck because she can be a pain to remove. This means she'll start gaining you lore early in the game to give you a little advantage.
Another item to fit the theme would be to add Fishbone Quill. We can use 4 copies here. This card allows you to ramp up, and along with lanterns, bringing out several characters at a time. This will cost us an extra $8.44, bringing it up the total to $24.90. Let's also add another 2 Hiram Flavershams. It's such a good card in this deck. Let's add 2 more copies, bringing the total to $27.06.
We're getting close to the end, but we need to have good finishers. Having a lot of items means we can play Tamatoa So Shiny. We'll get 3 copies of him for $4.20, bringing us to $31.26 total. Finally, we need some removal. So let's add 2 copies of Let It Go for $2.34 each, making our final total $35.94, leaving you with about $4 and some change.
Now that we've added a lot of cards, 30 to be exact, or half of the deck, we need to remove 30 cards to get our deck back to 60 and be more consistent. So let's move on to what to remove.
Well, looking at Amber, we removed 1 Christopher Robin because he's a little slow to get his effect going. We know you'll have 2 or more characters most of the time with the dwarves, but it takes a lot of time for him to get activated.
And we're removing 3 Gaston baritone bullies. Gaston is good for songs, and we only have 2 songs in the deck, so he's not that useful here. We're also removing 1 Grand Duke advisor to the king. His ability would only work for about 10 cards in this deck. However, it's not enough to be impactful.
We're removing 2 of LeFou with no Gaston. We don't really need LeFou. And we're also removing 2 Snow White Lost in the Forest. We basically traded the Snow White Lost in the Forest for Snow White that works better with the dwarves.
And we removed 2 Painting the Roses red. Drawing cards is great, however with items and item support, we have better card draw options. And that's the Amber part we removed. So let's move on to Sapphire and see what to remove. Starting with Belle, Inventive Engineer, and we'll remove 1 of her. While we do have items, there isn't as many for Belle to really be useful in this deck. You can always go full item route and keep her in, however with dwarves being a part of this deck, I wouldn't recommend it.
We've removed 3 copies of Cruella de Vil Fashionable Cruiser. Evasive has risen up on the scene, so if you wish to keep her in over Noi, I understand that. But Noi is one of those cards that pushes your total lore goal to bring you to 20 faster. Make it more of an aggro to mid-range style deck.
We also removed 1 Gaston Intellectual Powerhouse. We already have item-themed card draw in our deck. We also removed Gaston Baritone Bully, meaning there's nothing for Gaston Intellectual Powerhouse to shift on. And while this Gaston is good, it just seems kind of awkward when playing it in this deck.
We also removed 2 of Phil, Trainer of Heroes. He's a good challenger, but we do have a lot of 2-drops on the dwarves and Snow White. It would just slow down your game plan to play Phil.
And we removed 3 the Knot Water Spirits. Knot can be hard to remove with Ward. With cards like Gaston, Madame Mim Fox, and Rafiki, they can finish this card in 1 turn. We replaced Knock with Noi, something that comes out much earlier and is harder to remove that early in the game.
We removed 1 of Winnie the Pooh having a think. Instead of using Pooh, we went with Fishbone Quill due to it being an item and giving more support for the theme of the deck.
And we also removed 2 4 dozen eggs. Resist is great, however most of the doors have higher willpowers that small annoying characters can't deal with. It's not a bad card, just don't think it pushes your game plan for this deck.
We also removed 2 of the card Launch. We're already removing our items with Hiram, and sometimes with Judy Hopps as well, so having another card that's taking away our items would be too much. So we replaced this with Let It Go, a much better choice.
And finally, removed 2 Fang Crossbows and 2 Gumbo Pots. We replaced these 4 with Lanterns. We believe Lantern is a better option, allowing us to play more dwarfs, or to bring out Tamatoa early.
So that gets us back to 60. This leaves a final question. How does the deck run? Well, we tested this deck a few times and it actually runs pretty well.
It does have a weakness, and that is dealing with aggro decks that like to spread out the field faster than you. But if you can get your field spread out first, it's hard to deal with. Looking at the ink curve, this is definitely a mid-range style of deck, with the dwarves being a good chunk of that. And it's pretty consistent, especially since there are only a total of 8 uninkable cards in the whole entire deck. But if you want to improve this deck on a budget, this is a build you may enjoy.
Now let's look at the other starter deck, the Amethyst Steel Might and Magic, and see what we can add to make it even better. First, we want to build more on the bounce theme. So let's add 1 more Madame Mim Snake for 14 cents, and 2 copies of Madame Mim Fox for $4.13 each, bringing our total to $8.40 at the moment.
And since we have a lot of bounce, let's add more Enter the Battlefield effects. we've added 1 Merlin Goat for 20 cents, 2 Merlin Rabbits for $1.35 each, and 3 Maleficent Sorceress for 16 cents each, making our total $11.78.
We also want to build on this aggro theme, so we're going to add 3 of Maleficent Biding Her Time at $3.16 each, 4 of Pascal for 22 cents each, 2 Pinocchio Star Attraction at $3.93 each, bringing our total up to $30 even.
Then we need to protect our aggro characters, and a great way to do that is through Bodyguard. So let's add 2 copies of The Prince, Never Gives Up for 12 cents each, 2 copies of Hercules Divine Hero for 45 cents each, and 4 copies of Hercules True Hero for 4 cents each, bringing up the total to $31.30.
And finally, to make the deck more consistent, we're going to add a few cards for card draw and removal. So we added 2 copies of Let the Storm Rage On at 57 cents each, giving you damage for removal and drawing. We've got 4 copies of Friends on the Other Side for 17 cents each, giving you more card draw. 2 copies of the Huntsman Reluctant Enforcer for 17 cents each, that gives you more early lore and card cycling. We have 2 copies of Smash for 16 cents each as some more removal. 2 copies of Yzma Scary Beyond All Reason for $3.09 each to act as either a removal or card draw for yourself with some bounce on one of your cards like Merlin Goat or Rabbit.
So with adding these 38 cards, that brings the final total to $39.96, right below that $40 mark. And now we got 38 cards to remove without changing the goal of the deck.
Let's start out with Steel. We removed 2 Prince Eric, Dashing, and Brave. Its Challenger effect is great, but this deck wants to get moving as fast as possible, and challenging isn't something the deck focuses on.
Then we removed all 3 Lilo Galactic Heroes. While it does have 2 lore, it isn't doing much even with its 4 strength and 2 willpower to help the deck in a meaningful way.
We removed the 1 copy of Tiana Celebrating Princess and all 3 copies of Tiana Diligent Waitress. Tiana Celebrating Princess is another card not helping the aggro, lore, and bounce, and her effect is only active when you don't have any cards in hand, which isn't something that will see much use because we have a lot of card draw. As far as Tiana Diligent Waitress, we've added Pascal's and Maleficent Biding Her Time, which take over those 1-drop spots.
We then removed 2 Cinderella Knights in Training. She is a good card to cycle through your deck, however, she is not protecting or adding lore to allow you to move forward into your game plan.
We removed 3 copies of Prince Naveen. While he has good stats, he only has 1 lore. Also removed 2 copies of Eli LaBeouf, a vanilla 4-drop with 2 lore. Just isn't doing much for aggro lore rush.
And we removed both copies of Hercules, Hero in Training. While having this card in your deck could help shift up to Hercules Divine Hero that we just added, we've also added copies of Hercules True Hero to be a bodyguard and still be a shiftable option.
We removed the 1 copy of Kronk Jr. Chipmunk due to it having a higher cost and effect that doesn't really synergize with this deck. We also removed both copies of Lawrence. He's a card with good lore and stats, but we opted to go for more of a bodyguard bounce in this area.
And the last card we removed for Steel was Last Cannons, a card that is used for challengers, something you won't be doing often with this deck. And that's all the Steel cards removed, so let's check out what Amethyst cards to kick out now.
First off, we removed all the copies of Chip. We covered this earlier when we kicked out Tiana Diligent Waitress, but we have Pascal and Maleficent really being our main cards as 1-drops because they add the lore more efficiently. We also removed 3 copies of Kuzco Wanted Llama because we just have better draw options in this deck like Friends on the Other Side.
Remove both copies of Dr. Facile, Savvy Opportunist, and all 3 copies of Hey Hey, just because there isn't enough lore and no bounce mechanic going on between them.
Finally, we removed all copies of Freeze and I'm Stuck. These actions just stall opponents, they don't really help your win condition at all. Now we're back to 60. It leaves us with the last question, how does it run?
So this deck runs pretty well. Its weakness seems to be opponents with better aggro rush, due to it not being able to answer that many threats. Other than that, it plays very well.
The ink curve shows that it is an aggro deck, So we have 12 cards that are uninkable, since most of these cards are lower anyways. If you want to improve this deck on a budget, be sure to have some of these ideas in thought as you improve on this aggro lore rush deck.
Well, that's all for today. What have you done to improve these starter decks? Let us know in the comments below.
Be sure to follow us on social media to keep up to date on the latest Tactical Ink news.
And also be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you can tune in every Friday for a new episode of Tactical Ink. See you next week.